All right. I like that.
I know.
We are in Colossians. If you guys want to move over there, we're in chapter 1. Before we get started, I just got to remind everyone, August 27th, we have an apologetics conference. Y'all welcome to join us. It should be some good stuff.
John's talking
Uh,
about shorts.
I am, and I rewrote my stuff, March, and I'll have to share it with you. But I'm talking about shorts now.
No.
All right. So we have been going through Colossians. We looked about last week about how God is giving us this supernatural strength, but to persevere, to have patience and long suffering with joy, which is not quite what we expected, but that's what he's doing. He's given us all his power and his might so we can continue when things are hard. So it's interesting. Um, and it's really cool. We've been looking at that. Again, we're going through Paul, and he's just what he writes. There's just so much to it. So we're going really slow and having a good time with that, and we'll continue that. So we're going to be starting in verse 15 this morning. Before we get there, I just want to remind us, as we were started the book of Colossians, back in verse 4, Paul says, since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and your love for all the saints. And so he puts that, we've heard of your faith. And we talked about that a while ago, how, he's heard of that they trust in Jesus, the Christ. They've put their trust and confidence in him, and he's heard of it. And so he's talking, a lot about different aspects of that. And right now he's starting to talk about, well, last week he was talking about, how he was praying for them that they would have the full knowledge of his will, which is pretty cool. And now we are in this spot where he's going to tell them a little bit about who Jesus is, which is really interesting. It talks about who he is, what his responsibilities are a little bit, and so here we go. So we'll just jump into it. We're going to read verses 15 through 18. Let's see. I'm going to ask Jason to read that. No, I'm just kidding. Let's see. Mr. Edwards, could you read verses 15 through 18?
I would love to. All right, watch out. Sorry, put the cat down. Who is the image, excuse me, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature? For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence.
All right. So Paul here says there's some really good stuff here. This gets me excited because he says some things in here which to me that seems like a contradiction. That doesn't seem like that's even possible. And I like that because when we get to those things of, wait, that doesn't make sense. I think we're getting to, if we dig into it, we get a better understanding of God because there's some things we just don't understand about him. And so I like that. So we'll just start in verse 15. It starts with saying, he is the image of the invisible God. What do you think it means that he says this? He says that he is Jesus. He's the image of an invisible God. Let's start off by what do you guys think about that?
Well, it makes sense to me that you'd have to be able to see something. If God was to go down on earth, he couldn't be an invisible cloud being. You would have to be able to look to something, and if something was going to die for you, you'd have to be able to see it, right? Because that's how humans we perceive, and we take a lot of our information through our eyes. And so, yeah, it just makes sense to me that you have to be, and if you're going to follow something, you're going to have to be able to see it in order to follow it. People are going to have to witness it so that they can spread it to other people. And so that's just what makes sense to me, that he would come down in that form.
Basically, it says that we are made in the image of God. So of course, Christ is going to be the image of the invisible God. So that's, to me, it's pretty straightforward, because in the beginning, when we were made in his image. So of course, Christ is going to look like us.
All right.
Well, I think Old Testament and New Testament both, we have, God coming down either as a cloud or, when he did the covenant with Abraham, Moses. Anyway, where neither of them, they felt his presence, but hid him behind the cleft of the rock, and so God is, as far as we know biblically, he's an invisible object, but like Sean said, had to come down in the image of man so that we would comprehend, our little minute brains could comprehend who this God was.
Yeah, I like it.
John,
Mark, you gonna say something?
Yeah, John 14:9 says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right?
Yeah. So when I read this, because you guys know that I'm a little weird, I remember when I was a kid, and you probably did this silly thing too, where you get a white piece of paper and say, hey, look, I drew a snowman in a blizzard. And you didn't actually draw anything at all, right? Because it's not visible, you can't see it. And so this is kind of what I think of when he's saying that Jesus is the image of an invisible God. I'm like, wait a second, that when you're saying he's a visible of something that's not visible, that just doesn't, I don't get it. It's kind of funny. My son was showing my daughter this meme a while ago, which I thought was hilarious, or he thought was hilarious. And so I looked over his shoulders and looked at it, and it was two pictures side by side, and it said the colors that bees see, because they see a different range of colors than we do. And then it says colors that we see, and they were next to each other. And the funny thing is they are exactly the same. And the reason they're exactly the same is because we can't see the colors that the bees see. All we can see is the colors we can see. And so when we talk about this image of an invisible God, that's what I'm thinking of. This is a translation, a conversion of God, who is invisible, into something that is visible. So there's this conversion. I don't know if you guys have, you probably have. It's pretty common now to have a camera that that handles infrared. Like if you have a security camera, at the nighttime, and it has night vision, and it can see in the light, or it can see in the dark. Those are infrared cameras. And what they do is they shine a light in a spectrum that we can't see. So it doesn't look like there's any light, but the camera can see that. And so they pick that up, and then they bring it back into the camera, and in hardware, they convert that into something that we can see. So what you see is usually all gray, or it's all green. It's like grayscale, or it's green scale, or something like that. And you're not actually seeing what the camera is seeing or what the light is showing, because you couldn't see it. So what they do, it's shifted into a color scheme that we can see. And so I like this. This is, I think, the same idea of Jesus is the image of God who is invisible. So there's this shifting of his attributes and a shifting of him into a form that we can see and that we can understand. I'll put understand in quotes.
Well, John, to play off the infrared thing, what we see in that image is a reflective light. In other words, if there was nothing there, that screen would be gray or greenish gray or something like that. But the second an image comes in there, that infrared light bounces off and the camera picks it up, which kind of goes along with the same idea. What we're saying is the image of an invisible God, and here's Jesus.
Yeah. But one of the points that I'm making, and you're right, Charlie, this is all good. One of the points that I'm making, though, is what you were seeing is an image of it, but it's not the actual thing, right? Something has changed and made it into a way that we can perceive it, because we can't perceive infrared light. And so there has to be some type of thing that happens so that we can perceive it. And it's the same thing that we're talking about with God here. God is invisible. You can't see him. So something has changed so that we can see him. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring that up is because there is a conversion process that all happens all in that. And although we can get an image, we can't see it perfectly. Some of that information is lost, right? Some of the range of colors in the infrared spectrum are lost when we use an infrared camera because we can't see it. So it's translated into a different range of colors. And so it's the same thing where we have God, where he is spirit and he's invisible. And then we have Jesus, who is man and who is flesh. And in that process, some of the information is lost. And I'm not saying that some of the information of Jesus is lost. I'm just saying that we don't get to still see the whole picture. We get to see the image of God, but we don't get to see what God is fully like. We don't get to see the whole picture because there was this whole process. I don't know. What do you guys think? Can you think of some of the things that we might not see in Jesus, but it is still a characteristic of God because Jesus is man and God is invisible? Did any of that make just sense? I don't know if that even made sense.
Takes a little to digest that one.
I didn't know we were going to have a science class today.
You didn't read the email, Sean. You should have read the email.
John, do you mean like good human qualities that we see that reflect God's attributes through Jesus, whether it's not like a divine attribute or?
Yeah. Let me give you an example. God tells us that he doesn't change, but Jesus was born as a baby and he grew into a man, and there was some change that happened there. And so we see that with Jesus, there is some change because he's fully man, but with God, there isn't change, and he's invisible, he's spirit, so he doesn't have to have this limitation of a physical body. But when Jesus comes into our world, some of that we don't understand. So we might look at Jesus and say, oh, he grew up, so he must change, when really that's not what God is. God doesn't change. Did that make sense? I don't know if that even made sense.
Well, I could see Jesus's body changing as he grows up, but if he's God from the beginning, then the inside may be the same and not unchanging.
Absolutely. And this is something we don't want to miss. Jesus is man and he is God, right? He is fully man, he is fully God. So if I say something funky because I missaid it, don't get the impression that I'm not saying that. This is true. Jesus is man and he is God. But because he's man, we can misunderstand him a little bit and forget that he's also God. And so we could look at Jesus, his parents could look at him and say, well, he's just growing up, he's just a regular guy, and miss the fact that he's not, he's God. And so there's this cool aspect, and this is happening because, like I said, he's the image, he's the visible of an invisible God. How does that all work? And that is because there has to be some loss of our understanding when we move from invisible to visible. All right. Let's take a step back here for just a second. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things. I wanted to point out, two things. I said that, a couple of things. And the first is we have one of these things we have to catch is that we have Jesus, who's the image of an invisible God. The first thing I want us to see is that God did this so that we could see him, right? God is spirit. He is not visible. And we're walking around and we can't perceive him. And because we can't perceive him, we don't know anything about God, but God wants us to know about him. And so Jesus is the image of the invisible God, because part of that is because he wants us to know who he is. He wants us to have a relationship with him. And he knows, hey, you guys can't perceive me. So we're going to have this change here so that you can perceive God and that you can have that relationship. So this is one cool aspect of this whole thing. Just this phrase that Jesus is the image of an invisible God is the recognition that God wants us to see him, even though we don't have the abilities to perceive him. And so that's really cool. He has these characteristics that are some of these characteristics that he have are similar to us, right? He has personality. He has a will. He has some of these same things that we have. And as Sean said, we were made in the image of God. So that makes sense that we have some characteristics that are the same. But he also has some characteristics that are not the same. One of my favorites is, right, we experience time linearly, and God does not necessarily experience time in that way. He may not even, he doesn't exist in time. He has the option of jumping out of time, and he doesn't have to be constrained by it. Whereas not only do we experience time in one direction or in one dimension, but it's also in one direction. We can't even go backwards. So that's something that's different from God than from us. But we still have a lot of things that are the same, that are similar.
I love that aspect of grace, right? Like it's a demonstration of God's love and kindness to display himself in another way so we can understand him. So by sending Jesus, not only is he with a plan of salvation demonstrating grace, but he's demonstrating again grace by getting us to something where we can grasp a little bit, and that's Jesus. And so grace upon grace, but also the concept of not the infinite aspects of God necessarily, but like the relational and human aspects of God that we get to understand, the kindness, the giving, his opposition of religious activities, things like that you see in Jesus, how he acted and how he interacted with people and how he responded to things helps us to form a better picture of who God is in the way that he lived in the world. So I think there's it's kind of like a whole semester of discussion in that phrase, but yeah, absolutely. I love that aspect of God going, I want you to get to know me even more. And so I'm going to send my son, because if you've seen him, you've seen me,
You said that way better than I could. So thank you, March. That was excellent. Yes.
I blacked out. I don't remember what I said.
but this is, to me, this is exciting stuff. And the second point that I want to point out, or the second thing that I wanted to point out from this phrase, which I kind of already talked about a little bit, is that there is some loss in that conversion, not loss on him, but loss in our understanding. And we can get confused about things because we see Jesus as a man, and we think, and sometimes we portray these manly attributes onto him and think that he's constrained as a man the same way that we're constrained as a man, when he's not, because he's God. And so we get confused. And I find this super exciting, because that means that there's so much more about God and about Jesus. When I start looking at Jesus and he does something or he says something where I'm like, dude, that's not even possible. That's like a contradiction. Then I hit into one of those areas of where we have to remember that Jesus is also God, and he doesn't have the same constraints that we have. And so I like this whole thing. We have Jesus, who is the image of an invisible God. he looks like man, but he's not just man, he's God. And so I really like that. We're gonna get into a little bit of that this morning in the next verses. I also want to point out this is where a lot of people get confused, and we'll talk about that again in just the next verse. But you can get some weird doctrine and some weird ideas about Jesus. I'm sorry, about God, when you just think of him as a man, and he has the same constraints as a man, and he doesn't. So we don't want to get confused like that.
Mhm.
Before we move on to the next part, though, Paul says that God is invisible. What do you think that means? Why is God invisible? Some more sciencing stuff for you, Sean.
He's invisible because he created visibility. I mean, he's the one that makes it possible for us to see light and to record light. He's beyond that, man. He's not, it was just like you said, he's beyond time. He's beyond the physical world too.
Mhm.
Invisibility is part of the physical world.
Right.
It's just, I have no idea how to explain God, John. I mean, he's just way, way, way beyond my ability to explain this guy. I mean, this is a guy who can hold the whole universe in the palm of his hand. This is a guy who can speak and it comes to be. He wants to be invisible. That's his choice.
Well,
He doesn't
the
want to
thing
be
is,
invisible. That's his choice too.
the thing is we all know that God is present right now in each
Right.
one of our rooms, wherever we are. So we know that. And do you see him?
Right.
No, he's invisible. And that's how he is. The only way he could help us weak, feeble humans be able to understand anything about him was to send his son who looks like us, or we look like him, or better way to put it. So he is invisible because we all know, at least I hope you know, that he's right here in this room with me and wherever you guys are at. He's there, he's everywhere, because he's the invisible God.
But if we saw him, we probably would not trust him. If we could see God as he really is, it would probably be so strange to us that we would not trust him. But we can see Jesus, which is God became a man, and we can trust Jesus. We can't trust the physical created God because we can't see him. We can't even fathom what he's like. It's kind of like, well, I used to tell this story about birds, and these birds got caught in a storm, and this guy tried to save them, but he was a human being, and the birds all ran away from him. And he kept trying to drive them into his garage where they'd be safe from the storm. And anyway, in the end of it, the story, he decided, well, if only I could become a bird, I could go there and tell him. And that's kind of the same way with God and us. God, the creator, we can't see him, we can't understand him, we can't really put our trust in him, but we can put trust in his son, Jesus, because Jesus became a man, and we understand that.
That's
I don't
good.
know, maybe I'm running on.
No, that's good, Dan. And I think it's for our protection too, because at least from what I've learned about God in the Old Testament, is we would be crispy if he revealed his full glory to us. So for our protection, he's doing that at least while we're in these bodies.
Amen.
Look at like your, oh, sorry.
No,
like-
no, go ahead.
Like your infrared camera, John, like God is on a completely different spectrum to where we can't see him, but then we can see God in things. And like Sean said, he's always present. But when you really look at you, you can just see God in everything around us.
Because he is real, right? And he does impact our universe. He does impact our world, both in a large scale and in a small scale. He's interacting with our world. And so we can see those impacts. But I want to bring up one other thing about the fact that God is not visible, which if God's not visible, that would suggest he's not matter. He's not made out of physical material. He's not made out of atoms, because that's what we see is we see the light wavelengths bouncing off of things. And if God's not visible, he's not made of that. And that's important, because if he was made of that, that means he didn't create it, but he's not made of it because he created matter.
Yeah.
And so there's this cool aspect of knowing that God's not visible. He's not visible because he's not like everything else. He wasn't created. It's there's a lot of good stuff here. Go ahead, Sean.
So
You're going to
God-
say something.
So God does matter. Huh?
That's right. He makes matter. He does matter. He's not made of matter. I don't know. I don't know if this even matters.
In Isaiah 57, it says that God dwells in eternity, right? Like his address is eternity. That's what's amazing. So like to be visible is to kind of be limited to one place, right? So the very fact that he's not visible displays to us that he dwells in eternity, that he's consistently in eternity. But it's interesting because he does make himself visible sometimes. Even in the Old Testament, he does that. So even in that, he's not limited to eternity. You know what I mean? It's kind of like this double back amazing thing where if he was simply invisible all the time, then you would almost conclude that, oh, he's trapped in invisibility or in that also. But he chooses to go back and forth when he wants to. And it's an amazing aspect of the infinity of God that he could do that, right?
Yeah. And again, this is one of those aspects of him, right? Where if you see that he makes himself visible, you don't want to think, okay, well, that's what God looks like, because he did that for us. He's doing that for us. He's way more than that. So it's yeah, I like this.
So I have a question.
I was just going to follow up what March said, which is crazy, not only did he make himself visible in the Old Testament, he manifested himself in such a way he could wrestle with a man, right?
And
So
eat with
before
him.
his incarnation, he manifested himself in such a manner as just where you could physically grapple with him, which is kind of intense.
You're right. We're going to talk about that in this next section, because you're right. It's amazing. It's cool. Before we do that, though, Tim, were you going to say something?
I was just going to ask the group, would it have a positive or a negative impact on your faith if God was visible?
I'm not sure if it would be negative or positive, but it would be hard to feel like he was everywhere if you could see him and you could look around and see him, if that makes sense. And so just the omnipresence, and I'm not sure if it'd be as easy to believe in it if you could see him. You know what I mean? Because, hey, my parents over there, I know they're not looking at me, versus God is everywhere doing all things. So great question, Tim.
I think it would be a lot easier to counterfeit him if he was visible, right? If he had a specific form, then people would be like, oh, all I have to do is look like that specific form, and then I can claim to be him. So it almost makes him uncounterfeitable as well, because you can't say, hey, I'm God because I look like this. It's I'm God because of these other characteristics that you have to look at instead.
Especially with plastic surgery, you can just look like him with plastic surgery.
If you've seen Face Off, you know how it works.
Yeah, the other thing is Jesus came at the exact time that he was supposed to come, because if he came now, he'd be on Facebook, he'd be on all the social media. Everyone would know what Jesus looked like. And we don't know what he looked like. And that's a good thing, because again, just as everybody was saying, we would try to imitate whatever he would look like. And that would be becoming false gods ourselves.
I like that. That's a good point. All right. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right. So this so that was just the first part of the sentence. The next part of the sentence is equally interesting, if not more. So verse 15, he says, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And then I'm going to read 16 as well. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth. And then there's some more, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So we see here that Paul says that Jesus is, what does he say? The firstborn over all creation. So here's another paradox. He's the firstborn over all creation, except that he also created everything. So again, to me, this is a snowman in a snowstorm type of situation, right? Because you're saying that he was the first to be born, and yet he created everything. How does what do you think he means? What do you think Paul means when he calls Jesus the firstborn over all creation?
He was here first.
Okay.
Well, he was there in the beginning. He was, you know, Father said, let us make man in our image. There was God the Father, there was God the Son. And I'm getting into something I can't possibly explain. There was God the Spirit too. And so God the Son was specifically created to come to the earth to pay the price for our sins, to die for our sins, so that we could have redemption. But so that was part of the first plan of God the Father. Now, how to make all that tie together, again, you know, I can't explain God, but I would say that, you know, I can't doubt God either.
It puts him as the rank, as supreme. Like for your firstborn son, you might have other sons, but your firstborn kind of has a little superior rank above the others, and everything goes down through him, or to him, I guess. And when God is creating things, you figure out everything that's created, Jesus is the most important out of everything else. And so it puts him at the top.
Yeah, definitely. And we see that at the end of this section that we read, where it's saying that he may have preeminence. He is the most important of everything. And Paul's going to get into that in a little bit more detail on how he's more important than all these other things. But we don't want to miss that. He is the most important. He is preeminent. But I still love this.
So,
Sorry, go ahead.
so
Rachel.
the way I think of this is that God created everything. So here is this invisible God who is now going to start creating. The first thing he creates is his image, which we are alike.
Mhm.
So that is the first thing. So that's like the first miracle was I created an image and you guys look like it. And so for me, that makes sense that it says it as the firstborn, because that was the first thing created, because everything after that was then created by him.
I will point out something interesting is it doesn't actually say Jesus was created. It says he was firstborn, and then everything else was created. So it puts an interesting possibility on that, huh? That's good. I like it. What were you going to say, Dad?
He was begotten, not created. He's the only begotten Son of God. We were created by God. Jesus was begotten by God. Now, if something is begotten by that, then it is part of that. I could begot my son, begotten of me. He's part of me. A bowl is created by me. It's not part of me. It's something I created. There's a difference between being created and being begotten. And Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. So he's not created, he's begotten. He has, just like your children have part of you in them, Jesus has, I don't know how to say it, but Jesus is part of God. I mean, he's got God, he has the cell, well, we can't use cells, but whatever it is that God is made up of, which you have no idea what it is, Jesus is made up of the same thing.
Yeah. So let me interrupt for just a minute, Dad,
That's
because
funny.
That's
I
fine.
want to point out that we are talking about things that we don't have the ability to perceive or fully understand. So if we use language that isn't quite correct, we're going to give people mercy here and grace here, because we're trying to talk about something which we don't have all the tools to talk about it. So we will say words that it doesn't quite work, and we understand. It's good.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say, John. And thank God for John 1, right? Because then we don't have to reinvent that. Like in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And he became flesh. And the concept of God already began to explain this a little bit in that kind of understanding that he was God and he was in the beginning with God. Therefore, he's separate from creation. Right. And I'm going to go back to what Edward say. It's the concept of preeminence, like of rank. And even as it relates to later, like 3 weeks from now, when we finally hit verse 18, right, when it says the firstborn from the dead, right, is that it ties to that, but because I'm raising from the dead as a model of raising from the dead. And so it has nothing to do with him being created. He's separate from creation, and God has already provided us a perspective in John 1 on who Jesus is and his deity, so it's pretty amazing that we don't have to reinvent that.
Yeah, this is all good. I like all this. I want to bring up one other aspect of this, which I think is amazing, and I talk about it because I like the whole concept of time. But if we have God who isn't constrained by time, it totally makes sense that he could say that Jesus is the firstborn, even though that happens thousands of years later. In our perspective, he's not born until, whatever it is, 2 AD, 0 AD, somewhere around there, right? That's when he's born. That's from our perspective, because that's in our chronology. That's how we experience time. That doesn't mean that's how God experiences time. It doesn't mean that he can't say, hey, he was born first, although it happens, and the way you experience it happens 2,000 years, ago. But he can come back at step at a time and be in time at his will and at his pleasure. So it could, the way he experiences it is different than us, which to me, this is very exciting, because when Adam and Eve sin, and Jesus is, what was I going to say? When Adam and Eve sin and God says, hey, there's going to be this man, or there's going to be this one, actually he says this child of woman who's going to reconcile you. He's going to save you. From God's perspective, that's already happened, right? That's already been done. And so that firstborn, although he hasn't been born, from God's perspective, he's like, yeah, I see all that's going to happen over there, because that's Jesus already exists. He's already the firstborn. And so through the Old Testament, we see these places where there's God walking as a man and eating with people and wrestling people. And you're like, wait, is that Jesus? Totally could be, right? Because that's how God is. He's not constrained by time the same way that we are. He doesn't experience time in that linear fashion the same way that we do. So why couldn't it be Jesus who's over in the Old Testament hanging out with people? He already exists. That's what we're being told. He already exists. So it's really crazy. But again, I just want to point this out. God is so much bigger than our understanding. He experiences things in a way that we don't. And so we don't want to get caught up. And so people will read this and they'll get caught up in these interesting doctrine of, God, Jesus was the first created thing. And then but he's created as a man. So he's kind of man, kind of God thing, but he's not equal with God because he was created. And then you can get into all these weird doctrines, and you don't want to do that because he's bigger than what we understand. You don't want to put our constraints on him.
That word creation is interesting too, because we assume that it's just our existence and creation. And since God exists outside of that, what was before all of creation? Well, it was God. So, it's in our minds, or in my mind, it's a paradox, because there all of a sudden there's two creations, which is, who knows? I don't know. And so Christ existed prior to all of what we think is creation. I think, rambling again here.
I mean, it's funny. We're trying to use terminologies that may not even make sense, right? Is
Yeah.
there a before creation? I mean, if he didn't make time yet, then there's no actual before. But how does that work? I don't know, right? Because time is totally wrapped up in my existence. I don't understand how you could not exist within time. It's really interesting. I like it.
We're trying to cram an infinite God in a box to understand.
Exactly. We're trying to make an invisible God visible, and we're gonna lose something when we try to do that.
Nice. In the famous passage that we say in during Christmas, Isaiah 9:6, unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. That's not interchangeable, right? Like the son is given, the child is born. Like, it's not the son is born, child is given, right? It's specifically that way, and it speaks about God's kind of delineation of where Jesus is. Like, he is given as the son, but he was not necessarily born. The child is born, the body is born. So it's cool for us to see, like, these, this picture of, again, the picture of the invisible God going, man, God demonstrating his kindness just to be able to show us, like, hey, this is me in action, but Jesus is invisible to us now anyway. So
Yes. All right. I'm trying to decide if we should even tackle this next part here in verse 16. Let's see.
Tackle it, John. Tackle.
All right. So, yeah, we got 10 minutes. We can do a little bit of this. So we're verse 15, we're verse 16. It says, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth. And then Paul's going to give this interesting list of things, this interesting list to show how big Jesus is, and how he was creating all these things that he has responsibility over. And so we see that it says, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on the earth. So that's one. Earth, or visible and invisible. That's interesting. Whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. And again, there's more than 10 minutes worth of stuff in there, so we're not going to get through all of this, but we'll just start with this first part, that he created everything that is in heaven and that is on earth. And so from our perspective, right, earth is the most important part of the universe, because that's where we live, and that's where we have the most, where we walk around and where we are. So, but that's a small, tiny part of the universe. And when he says heavens there, he's talking about the outer sky, it's the universe. So what he's saying is God has created the entire universe, both everything you can see that's way out there and here on earth. And I like the way that Paul phrases it. He's saying heaven and earth. He could have just said the universe. He could have just said, and God created everything. But he qualifies it by saying the heaven and the earth. And I think part of the reason to say it that way is to show that both God made all the big things and he made all the small things. He made everything, the universe, which is entirely gigantic, which we can't comprehend. It's so vast and so large. And then he's also very personal, and he came and he made that little space that you walk on, that little place that you call home and you wander around on. He also made that. So we've got this picture of a God who's both infinite and personal, both making everything and also aware of all of the details where you're at. So I like this picture. Any comments before we move on to invisible and visible?
When I hear heaven and earth, it makes me think of looking up and looking down. And like you said, John, you look up and you see how expansive space is in general, how you can't see the end of it. And, oh, dryer finally stopped. And then if you look down at the earth and really get down on your hands and knees and see how small things are, and the fact that God created all of it is just something to behold of. I don't know, I think about every once in a while, I look at the mountains and look at the houses on them and think about how everything is in God's plan. He planned for all of this, and it and included us in it. It's just it's a special thing. It's a real special thing.
And we can get the wrong impression if we just focus on one of those aspects, right? If we just focus on how big God is and how vast the universe is and how he created it, we can get this idea that God is some being that's just way up there and that's just so far away because he has so much that he has to take care of that he doesn't know what's going on with us. But Paul is saying he didn't just make the heavens, he made the earth. He's making where you are as well. And so we don't want that perspective of him just being far away. And conversely, we can get the perspective of, oh, he's just right here and he's not, he's taking care of me, but he can't see everything that's going on because he's right here. And so by saying it this way, it's helping us to focus on the fact that he is both large and he's involved in the minute details as well.
Minute being DNA.
And there's so much about this that we don't even understand, and he totally understands. And we think that we understand DNA. I suspect we will discover that it's even more detailed than what we think. In a cell, there's DNA, and then there's a section that they call junk DNA, which is DNA that's it's three-dimensional. It's all over the place inside the nucleus. And for a long time, scientists were thinking, they called it junk DNA because it didn't do anything and it's not important. But I suspect we'll find out that it is actually important. It does actually influence how we are grown and all of that stuff. And so there's even more details than we recognize or realize, and he knows all about that too.
Now they're saying there is no junk DNA, John. They're finding subroutines within the routines, within the subroutines that all these DNA is connected to. And the term junk DNA is no longer exists. It's just, we don't know what it does, but it does something, and it all works together.
And there's even more than that.
No such thing as junk DNA.
But it's even more than that too, because it's three-dimensional, and so placement of where it's at is important as well. And we haven't even started looking at some of the aspects of it as well. It's really cool. There's just so much. God's just amazing, and he knows all these little tiny details which we still don't even know. I think we're going to have to hang it up here because we're not going to have enough time to go over the visible and invisible, which I know we just talked about just now, but I have a whole couple of paragraphs in my notes on this stuff too. So we'll pause here. I really enjoy this type of stuff. I really enjoy bumping into these paradoxes and finding out that God is so much bigger than what we imagine him to be, that we get into these places where we don't know how to use words to explain him because he just doesn't fit in the way that we're trying to describe. I love finding this out. So I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I get jazzed when I run into these things.
Enjoy your enjoyment, John.
Good.
Makes me happy.
Anybody have any last comments before we pray and close it out?
I'm gonna have to rest after this.
Yeah.
Well, I think it just goes back to the aspect that, you know, we serve a great and mighty God, and just goes to show it.
And as great and as amazing as he is, he was interested in us.
Mhm.
He's interested in revealing himself to us, making himself visible so that we can see who he is, so that we can know him. It's incredible because he's created so many things, you know, and if you look out, you can see things that are like, wow, that's cool. I would like to get to know what that's all about. And I don't know about why you would want to get to know what this is all about, but he does. All right, let's see. Tim, would you pray for us?